Welcome back, everybody. We are now going to hear an opening statement on behalf of the Mayor of London by Miss Anne Studd, Queen's Counsel, who's appearing by video this time. Good afternoon, Miss Studd.
Good afternoon, sir.
And you can hear me, I hope, and see me?
Yes, I can.
Indeed, all three of us?
I can see all three of you.
Right, well, you're going to make a statement now, and if you're ready, off you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in this part of the module, the inquiry will, for the first time, examine what the government knew or ought to have known about the weaknesses and failings in the building regulations and the associated documents as a result of the learning from other earlier fires, and what was or ought to have been done in response to that information. The built environment is kept safe for those who live and work in it, in large measure by instilling compliance with the building regulations, together with the guidance in the approved documents which sit alongside them. The statutory framework also informs the decisions of those who attend in response to an emergency. There is clear evidence that central government were aware of the shortcomings of approved document B as far back as 2012, when a decision was made to commission wide-ranging research to inform a wholesale review of it. On the night of the fire, critical and crucial decisions were made on the assumption that the building regulations and approved document B had been complied with and were fit for purpose. They clearly were not, and central government ought to have known that they were not. The inquiry is going to hear from current and former ministers, officials and civil servants with first-hand knowledge of what was known prior to 2017 about the effectiveness and efficiency of the building regulations and approved documents, the concerns being raised in relation to the fire risk in high-rise buildings, and what action was being taken by government. There is a divergence of evidence about what was done and indeed what ought to have been done, which will be a matter for the inquiry to assess. But there are a number of features of the evidence that the Mayor would urge the inquiry to give particular consideration to in an effort to prevent future tragedies occurring where known risks have been identified. Rule 43 of the Coroner's Rules 1984 as amended, and Rule 28 of the Coroner's Investigations Regulations 2013 concern the statutory obligation of the coroner in relation to the prevention of future deaths. This obligation is intended to ensure that the coroner's learning from hearing the evidence in a particular inquest or inquests is transferred to those with the power to change the system. It reflects the needs for those with that responsibility to be made aware of the problems, faults or failures so that the system can be reformed, adapted and amended in order to prevent future deaths occurring as a result of the same or similar failures. It is that part of the coroner's statutory function that is intended to give those families who have suffered bereavement some degree of closure and comfort, knowing that lessons have been learned from the deaths of their loved ones. On the 28th of March 2013, in the aftermath of the inquests into the deaths of 6 individuals who lost their lives in the tragic Lakanal house fire, Her Honour Francis Kirkham sent a letter pursuant to Rule 43 of the Coroner's Rules to Sir Eric Pickles, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. She made wide-ranging recommendations to the DCLG, which have significant resonance and familiarity to the issues that you've been asked to consider in your inquiry into the fire at Grenville Tower. The Mayor summarises the more relevant and important issues, some of which you've already considered in the earlier part of this module. First, the need for sufficiently clear fire safety advice to be given to residents of high-rise residential buildings in the case of fire within the building. Secondly, the need for national guidance to be disseminated to residents in relation to the stay put principle and its interaction with the get out and stay out policy. Thirdly, the benefit of retrofitting of sprinklers and the need to encourage providers of housing in high-rise residential buildings containing multiple domestic premises to consider the retrofitting of sprinkler systems. Fourthly, the need for a review of approved document B to ensure that it provides clear guidance in words and format that are intelligible to the wide range of people required to use it. And in relation to Regulation B4 of the building regulations, with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether proposed works might reduce existing fire protection. Those issues are all relevant and important considerations for this inquiry as a result of the dreadful tragedy at Grenfell Tower. And the inquiry will want to know from those in power why it was that 4 years after those matters had been raised by the Assistant Coroner in relation to Lakanal House, another tragic fire happened involving many of the same issues with devastating consequences. The Mayor does not suggest that the machinery of government can resolve complex issues such as these in a matter of weeks or months. But neither should matters which were considered sufficiently serious and urgent to have resulted in a prevention of future death report be liable to extensive delay on the political whim of a department or a minister. What is clear here is that in the days following the fire, the DCLG were running for cover and acknowledging that, and I quote, "the lack of urgency or reason for delay is striking, and the fact that our focus is on red tape is very clear." From the evidence disclosed to the inquiry and to be examined over the coming weeks, it seems that there were two fundamental problems which this inquiry should examine. The first was the rapid change in personnel in DCLG and latterly the Home Office, which had primacy over the issues with which this inquiry is concerned. And the second was the ability of that department to delay or avoid dealing with issues which had been highlighted by the Assistant Coroner and about which the DCLG had given assurances in 2013. The Secretary of State, Sir Eric Pickles, responded to the Assistant Coroner's Rule 43 letter on the 20th of May 2013. On the timing of the review of approved document B, he said, "We have commissioned research which will feed into a future review of this part of the building regulations. We expect this work to form a basis of a formal review leading to the publication of a new edition of approved documents in 2016-17. The research referred to amounted to 7 work streams commissioned from BRE in 2012. They reported in February 2015. They needed to be published to enable external stakeholders to feed into the review. Those work streams covered periods of fire resistance, maximum compartment sizes, construction details, roof voids, cavity barriers, and fire and smoke dampeners, fire protection of basements and basement car parks, sprinkler provisions, space separation, and means of escape for disabled people. This demonstrates that after the Lakanal House fire, there was already an awareness in government that there were areas of concern which required a proper review, even before they were the subject of recommendations from the coroner. Work was already underway by the time the coroner made her recommendations, which makes the subsequent delays even more striking. The general election called for the 7th of May 2015 prevented publication in early 2015, and following the new appointments of the relevant ministers, it was not provided to them until December 2015. The workstream research papers referred to the minister in December 2015 for publication, and in October 2016 an update was provided as publication had still not taken place. It is clear that a number of attempts had been made to get authority for publication without success. The inquiry will hear from those who were responsible for and failed to drive these reforms forward, but the evidence from the civil service suggests that while they were well aware of the issues and reiterated the commitment made to the Assistant Coroner in 2013, issues were not addressed with any urgency. There was a failure to sign off publication of the research to enable this to be carried forward within a reasonable time, or at the very least, to enable the department to fulfil its commitment. In spite of the assurance given to the Assistant Coroner, confusion and inaction seem to have been prevalent. In November 2015, Brian Martin was emailing saying, and I quote, "We have not announced a formal review of approved document B, so there's no timetable for that, and no guarantee we will do one." The regular reminders sent to progress matters were not acted upon, and the delays were compounded by the Brexit referendum and the subsequent general election. There is no requirement by an incoming minister to continue with the commitment of his or her predecessor, and this had the effect that these issues of public safety started from the beginning each time the relevant minister changed. Furthermore, in the aftermath of the 2015 election, the focus of the department was perceived to have changed. As Richard Harrell records in his statement, the position in September 2015 was set out in a briefing to ministers. Paragraph 10 of the briefing began as follows. The current fire safety provisions in Part B of the Building Regulations for England were published in 2006. A further review had been planned for 2013, but this was postponed whilst the department focused its attention on other priorities, including the red tape challenge and the housing standards review. Paragraph 11. In 2013, the inquiry into the 6 deaths at the fire of Lakanal House recommended that the guidance in approved document B should be simplified. Eric Pickles' response to the coroner set out his intention to review Part B during this Parliament, and that this would include simplification where this was possible. And paragraph 12, a detailed work plan for building regulations is yet to be agreed with ministers, but we are looking to review how this guidance documents can be improved. A substantive review in 2013 may have resulted in a better outcome for Grenfell Tower. Richard Harrell recognised too that post-election in 2015, any increase in the financial burden from regulatory change would be unwelcome. In spite of much toing and froing, no discernible progress was made from the receipt of the research in December 2015 to the time of the Grenfell fire in June 2017. Overlaid upon the changes of personnel was the policy of deregulation, the red tape challenge, and the perceived need for 1 in, 2 out. Any additional regulation could only be effective in the event that 2 sets of regulations could be repealed. As a result, it would appear that during 2016, there was a move away from the assurance of the full review of approved document B given to the Assistant Coroner in 2013, to a position where, and I quote, the proposal for reviewing ADB was a limited scope review focusing on simplification and specific technical issues. The submission noted this would help to manage expectations and strong lobbying for the expansion of regulation. This would lead to an update of ADB, which would also fulfil the last government's commitment to clarify guidance in this part of the regulations, which was a recommendation from the Lakanal House Coroner in 2013. From the outside, it looks like lip service being paid to an assurance previously given. For the sake of these bereaved survivors and residents, and others who may come after them, the inquiry will need to consider what can be done to ensure that assurances provided to coroners as part of their statutory function to prevent future deaths are followed through and completed in full, regardless of a change of personnel, general election, or even government policy. The implementation of safety critical recommendations must not be sidelined for political convenience. If this can be allowed to happen, then one wonders about the fate of important recommendations made by this inquiry. The Mayor has, in correspondence with the Government, supported Inquest's call for a national oversight mechanism to ensure that recommendations from inquiries and inquests are systematically followed up. As of the date of Brian Martin's statement in 2018, the reports he had commissioned in 2012 had still not been published. The third-party stakeholders had not been able to provide their comments and assistance, and the review, completion of which had been promised to the coroner in 2016-17, had not taken place. There were people actively seeking to facilitate the recommendations that had been made. On the 5th of August 2014, 17 months after the Assistant Coroner's Rule 43 letter, the all-party parliamentary group on fire and rescue, under the chairmanship of the late David MS, wrote to the Minister, Stephen Williams. It invited 3 simple changes to be made to approved document B immediately. 2 are relevant to this inquiry. First, that the report on the effectiveness of residential sprinklers be updated to reflect later more favourable 2012 research. Secondly, to reinstate the requirement of 1-hour fire resistance to the window panels, reflecting the concerns raised at Lakanal House that the window sets and panels had burned through in 4.5 minutes, leading to the spread of the fire to other flats. Those amendments would, at the very least, have reinforced to third parties the need for the Lakanal House issues to be addressed forthwith. In spite of those recommendations, from a group that might be thought to have significant expertise in this area, the department, through Stephen Williams, considered that such a recommendation would amount to a significant policy change and would not be consistent with the policy on sprinklers and regulation more generally. In 2014, at a meeting between the APPG and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary Penny Mordaunt, the APPG expressed its concern that the department was not giving urgent attention to the coroner's recommendations to amend the building regulations in advance of the current planned review, which was expected to be completed during 2016 and 17. Penny Mordaunt responded that Stephen Williams had explained in a letter dated the 19th of September that he had neither seen nor heard anything that would suggest that these specific changes were urgent, and that he was not willing to disrupt the work of the department by asking that these matters be brought forward. The response from the APPG is chilling when viewed in the light of subsequent events. As you rightly point out, this is a matter for your ministerial colleague Stephen Williams MP. However, the group has since written to the Minister saying that they were at a loss to understand how he had concluded that credible and independent evidence, which had life safety implications, was not considered to be urgent, when amendments of much lesser importance to the approved document had been made between reviews. As a consequence, the group pointed out to the Minister that should a major fire tragedy with loss of life occur between now and 2017, in, for example, a residential care facility or a purpose-built block of flats, where the matters which have been raised here were found to be contributory to the outcome, then the group would be bound to bring this to others' attention. 12 months later, with no progress having been made, the APPG sought a meeting and clarity from the new Minister, James Wharton MP. The briefing for that meeting contains the following. The current fire safety provisions in Part B of the Building Regulations for England were published in 2006. A further review had been planned for 2013, but this was postponed whilst the department focused its attention on other priorities, including the red tape challenge and the housing standards review. The APP record of the meeting which took place with James Wharton was noted as being largely more positive than had been the case with his predecessor, Stephen Williams. The APPG went on to note, should the review of the approved document in fact proceed as intended, then whilst some clarification and simplification in the guidance is necessary, it is felt that any changes need to consider best practice and new technology in construction, and to reflect today's built environment, where fire safety is wider than the fire and safety rescue services alone, because emergency firefighting is a measure implemented when safety features and protection have failed, and we need to remove this eventuality as much as possible. These are the views of both the fire and construction sector, who are of one mind that such problems are challenging both its members and may be compromising both life and socio-economic safety. It went on prophetically. Today's buildings have a much higher content of readily available combustible material. Examples are timber and polystyrene mixes in structures, cladding and insulation, with entire internal fire protection usually afforded by layers of plasterboard and use of fire-stopping padding. A plasterboard compartment is often incomplete above false ceilings and becomes imperfect over time through DIY and wear and tear. This fire hazard results in many fires because adequate recommendations to developers simply do not exist. There is little or no requirement to mitigate external fire spread. In the autumn of 2016, there was again pressure to publish a discussion document on the amendments to the building regulation and to highlight the need to publish the original reports which had been available for 18 months but had not been published to other stakeholders. The regular requests for updates by the APPG and concerns raised by the civil service that the assurances given to the assistant coroner had not been met did not meet with action. In March 2017, the discussion document was finally provided to the then Minister, Gavin Barwell. It set out the current thinking in relation to the review. It made reference to the savings that were to be made by way of deregulation, but not a single reference to the need to prevent loss of life as a result of the fire at Lakenhall House, nor that it was a culmination of the assurance provided to the Assistant Coroner in May 2013. The general election was called on the 18th of April 2017 and took place on the 8th of June 2017, with the Grenville Tower fire occurring less than a week later. The issues raised by the Lakenhall House inquests had not been addressed by central government, and neither had the government fulfilled its assurance given to the coroner that approved document B would be reviewed. The bereaved survivors and residents need to know why this was. They need to know whether a focus on public safety and the prevention of loss of life, rather than deregulation and the red tape challenge, would have made a difference on the night of the fire or to the safety in other buildings. And they need to know that the recommendations that this inquiry makes will be implemented in full and promptly to avoid a situation where assurances are given and are not then fulfilled. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Studd. Finally, this afternoon, we're going to hear an opening statement on behalf of the Fire Brigades Union by Mr. Martin Seaward.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Seaward. Well, when you're ready. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir, members of the panel and assessors who are listening. The Fire Brigades Union and its members, including the firefighters, control staff and fire safety officers we represent, remain humbled by the Grenville Tower fire and committed to a full and open inquiry. You already have our detailed written statement, and today we focus on the following issues: asking the panel to reconsider calling Matt Rank to give evidence to this inquiry, central government's deregulatory agenda, which created a culture of complacency and was accompanied by a war on health and safety. So the workforce need a voice in this inquiry. The FBU has filed witness statements with the GTI and has proffered its General Secretary Matt Rank to testify. That offer remains open. The GTI team have so far declined to call him. Firstly, The FBU refutes the criticisms levelled against the union by some witnesses in modules 5 and 6. For one example, Ron Dobson has repeatedly tried to attribute part of the blame for the LFB's own shortcomings on poor industrial relations and industrial action by the FBU. The FBU refutes that evidence. Secondly, the inquiry is considering issues of profound importance to the LFB's workforce without hearing from its trade union representatives. We consider this is both unfair and dangerous. Among the lessons to be learned from this inquiry is the need for decision makers to listen carefully to those who are directly affected by those decisions. Thirdly, Matt Rack can assist the inquiry with his knowledge and experience acquired over a long fire service career, nearly 20 years as General Secretary of the FBU. The FBU has always considered its role as being wider than addressing matters of pay, terms and conditions, and has for many decades been a key voice on fire policy and fire safety. But the FBU was not in charge of and didn't manage the LFB. The FBU has tried to deliver institutional memory within the Fire and Rescue Service, something sadly lacking from so many in leading positions. We ask the panel to recall, but do not here repeat, the description of the FBU's role representing its members and campaigning for improved health and safety, given in our opening oral submissions for Module 5, on day 176 at page 116, line 23 and following. So far in phase 2, the inquiry is heard only from senior LFB managers, yet the firefighters, control staff and fire safety officers working in London are directly affected by the issues being considered, and their union, the organisation representing them as professional practitioners, should be heard. Yes, we can make submissions, but submissions are not evidence. We urge that Matt Rack be called and given the opportunity to answer the criticisms levelled against the FBU and to put the union's different perspective on the issues being considered in modules 5 and 6. Turning to our submissions for this part of module 6, and starting with the central government's deregulatory agenda, which created a culture of complacency. The Grenfell Tower disaster was not simply the result of failings by individual professionals or private companies or due to underfunded public services struggling to cope, although these all played their part. The fundamental underlying causes of the terrible loss of life at Grenfell Tower lie in political decisions made by central government in the service of a social and economic system driven by profit and greed. These have both encouraged and facilitated a culture of complacency towards building safety, fire safety, and health and safety in general. For more than 4 decades, policies relating to housing, local government, building control, the Fire and Rescue Service, fire safety, including testing and certification of construction products, fire risk assessment, and other related areas, have been driven by an agenda of deregulation, privatisation, and marketisation. This agenda has been driven by the profit needs of private businesses, with corporate interests being prioritised over and above the needs of citizens, and with the specific neglect of those living in social housing. It's been characterised by an unseemly tolerance of cronyism and corruption. It has been accompanied by inadequate oversight and enforcement of the building and fire safety regimes, by austerity cuts and the war on health and safety. This, in our submission, has predictably diminished respect for health and safety, portrayed rules and regulations as bureaucratic and unnecessary red tape, whereas they are vital for building and fire safety, degraded public services, including building control and fire and rescue services, and thereby weakened enforcement of these regimes. And it's led to the abolition of national bodies, ambiguity and confusion in the guidance, which has been left unclarified, a culture of complacency created towards fire safety, both during and after building works, and private companies being enabled to put profit over people. Together, these factors have created the culture of complacency with the increasingly prevailing attitude that safety didn't matter, and so contributed to the systemic failure of the building and fire safety regimes, thereby enabling the installation of cheap and dangerous rain screen cladding systems all over the UK, including at Grenfell Tower. This is a national disgrace. The impact of this culture can be seen in the approach of pretty much all of the private sector companies involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, Safety considerations simply didn't cross their minds, as we have set out in paragraph 84 of our written opening statement. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to screen the first document. That's FBU, I think it's 50108 at page 40. It's paragraph 121. Thank you very much. Excellent. The deregulatory agenda started with Margaret Thatcher in 1979 and gathered pace thereafter. It found its apotheosis at Grenfell, yet is still being pursued. So under the Conservative administrations of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, publicly owned industry and council housing was sold off, public services were contracted out, repeated policy statements were made in favour of cutting red tape, or more accurately, removing restraints from business. Key examples include Lord Young's Lifting the Burden White Paper, Francis Maude's Deregulation Unit of 1986, Michael Heseltine's Deregulation Task Force of 1994. The new Labour regime of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown from 1997 to 2010 did not reverse deregulation, but simply renamed it Better Regulation. Their measures included the Regulatory Reform Act 2001, Philip Hampton's Reducing Administrative Burdens Report of 2005, and the Less is More report of 2005, proposing the one-in and one-out rule. David Cameron and Theresa May's administrations from 2010 to 2017 then accelerated the deregulation drive, coupled with austerity. Examples proliferate. The coalition agreement between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats backed deregulation and undertook to cut red tape. One-in, one-out was actually introduced in 2011. Mr Cameron's red tape challenge was in 2011. Francis Maude's Open Public Services White Paper was in 2012. Vincent Cable and Mr Fallon introduced a one-in, two-out policy in 2012. Oliver Letwin introduced the Deregulation Act of 2015, and Sajid Javid's one-in, three-out policy was in 2016. Even after Grenfell, the drive to deregulate continues under Prime Minister Johnson, whose adherence to rules is at best sporadic, and as recently as February 2021 convened the Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform, TIGR, and in October launched the Reforming the Framework for Better Regulation consultation. Deregulation and its push for so-called flexibility is deadly dangerous without a strong health and safety culture and adequate enforcement of the rules. Instead of providing strong leadership to reinforce the importance of health and safety at a time of regulatory reform, David Cameron declared war on the health and safety culture, which he described as pointless time wasting, and so contributed to the culture of complacency towards health and safety, which we've seen repeatedly manifested in modules 1 and 2. This enabled the manufacturing construction industries to put profits before people, and for those involved in Grenfell to game the system. The citation on screen that you can see now is of then Prime Minister David Cameron's speech declaring war on the health and safety culture. He said the government is waging war against the excessive health and safety culture that has become an albatross around the neck of British businesses. This coalition has a clear New Year's resolution to kill off the health and safety culture for good. I want 2012 to go down in history not just as Olympics year or Diamond Jubilee year, but the year we get a lot of this pointless time wasting out of the British economy, British life, once and for all. That was in January of 2012. Thank you. I wonder if you could screen the next document, which is from Professor Bisbee's report, LBYP 2601, at page 113, and it's paragraph 589. Thank you. So we're now looking at the way deregulation affected building regulations. And obviously there was a stream of consultation, but it ended with the Building Act of 1984, which created the role of private approved inspector to act in competition with the local authority building control services, and thereby started the process of marketising building control. It introduced the Building Regulations 1985, which replaced the previously detailed technical and prescriptive regulations covering at least 300 pages, with functional requirements covering just 25 pages, supplemented by guidance in ADB. And the privatisation of the building research establishment in 1997 created the potential for serious conflicts of interest, which we have seen laid bare in this inquiry. By then, its workforce had already been halved and had been made to follow commercial imperatives, be more responsive to industry. In 1990, it was made an executive agency, no longer the government's in-house testing body. It was required to compete in the market. So the introduction of functional requirements and guidance was a major change. It brought significant flexibility for building designers, manufacturers and builders. Notwithstanding, industries must be expected to seek to exploit regulatory systems for their own benefit. This increased flexibility was not accompanied by measures to ensure adequate oversight and effective enforcement. Inevitably, therefore, and predictably, the increased flexibility introduced ambiguity that could be and was exploited by some in the construction industry. It's thus produced a regulatory regime for building and fire safety which is not fit for purpose, as now accepted by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, commonly known as DULUX. As Professor Bisbee states, and that's in the citation, paragraph 589, yes, there it is. Thus, in the period from 1986 until 1996, the vision that Heseltine had initially set out in 1979 was largely realised. The construction industry had been granted the flexibility it had been seeking, essentially since the 1930s, and the creation of private building control meant that designers and contractors were no longer necessarily limited by constraints applied by local authority building control. The race to the bottom had begun. Thank you. If you could replace that with, or just go to paragraph 261 page 261, paragraph 1598. Thank you very much. And he concludes, this is Professor Bisbee, while the guidance in approved document B could have been clearer and or more restrictive, it was the structure and overarching philosophy of the wider regulatory framework.
Mr. Seaward, I'm not sure we've got the page on the screen that you want, have we?
I'm so sorry. No, we haven't yet, but I think it's there now. It's paragraph 1598.
Right, thank you. We have it now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Finally, is that it?
Well, that's 1598.
That is 1598. No, that's... oh, yes. So does that say... yes, there it is. So if it starts finally and fundamentally. This analysis shows that while the guidance in approved document B could have been clearer and or more restrictive, it was the structure and overarching philosophy of the wider regulatory framework that created and perpetuated and indeed encouraged the conditions in which the ambiguous guidance could be misinterpreted, misapplied, and or exploited in the service of generating profit, whilst avoiding, thus far, liability for inadequate design decision-making. The evidence in phase 2 of this inquiry on the installation of the rain screen cladding system on Grenfell Tower shows that the problems of this unfit-for-purpose regime were even worse than Dame Judith Hackett had imagined. Ignorance. Whereas she reported that regulations and guidance were not always read and understood by the necessary people, turns out they were not read by any of them in the Grenfell refurbishment. Indifference. Whereas she reported that due to a motivation to do things as quickly and cheaply as possible, safety was not always treated as a priority and some made attempts to game the system, it turns out that safety was never treated as a priority, with no one thinking fire, and all the manufacturers and most of the key players involved in the refurbishment gaming the system. Likewise, all the private companies were trying to get the job done as quickly and cheaply as possible, without regard to safety. Whereas she reported a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities exacerbated by a level of fragmentation within the industry, it turns out that everyone involved in the refurbishment mistakenly thought that compliance was the responsibility of building control. This led to reduced ownership and accountability, which has been played out in phase 2, with the merry-go-round of buck passing continuing to turn. Even now, only a few core participants, notably all public bodies, including the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the National House Building Council, UCAS, and now also DULUX, have admitted failures. see paragraph 137 of their written opening statement for this module. I won't read it out, I'm sure you've got it. This belated admission, we say, is not enough. The disaster was not simply caused by lack of oversight, with the government and public authorities being taken advantage of by a few unscrupulous companies. Grenfell Tower was a systemic failure of a regime actively and regrettably deliberately created by central government, which encouraged companies to behave recklessly towards building safety. Please now turn to the next document, which is from Professor Bisbee's report at page 2, paragraph 6. We set out the evolution of ADB with its ever greater complexity and flexibility, bringing concomitant ambiguity and scope for manipulation in more detail in our written submissions, and others have doubtless done a much better job of it. But in short, there were several elements of confusion, particularly over the permitted use of Class 0 materials, the meaning of limited combustibility, the meaning of filler materials, the need for large-scale testing, and the use that could be made of test data. The need for large-scale testing of every configuration of a rain screen cladding system was well known to government, at least since the Select Committee reported on the 5th of January 2000, recommending large-scale tests of cladding systems. And staying at paragraph 20, this is the 2000 Select Committee report, we believe that all external cladding systems should be required either to be entirely non-combustible or to be proven through full-scale testing not to pose an acceptable level of risk in terms of fire spread. Yet this requirement was dropped in 2006 with the introduction of desktop studies. The evidence shows that those involved in the construction industry, the professionals advising them, including architects, including also the BRE, and the experts assisting Her Majesty's coroner at the Lakanal House inquest, were confused by the guidance in ADB for at least 25 years before the fire. It also shows the government was aware of the confusion, yet failed to clarify it, missing countless opportunities to do so since 1992. This confusion was plainly evident in those involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment and was ruthlessly exploited by manufacturing companies for their own commercial self-interest. We've set that out in our paragraph 41. Mirroring the tragedy caused by the same central failing at the Edge in 2005 and at Lakanal House in 2009, the Grenfell Tower disaster was due primarily to the selection and installation of a highly combustible rain screen cladding system, which could have been avoided if there had been clear, simple provisions in ADB, withdrawing the use of Class 0 classification and preventing the use of combustible materials in rain screen cladding systems on an existing high-rise residential building. It is shameful that it took the deaths of 72 people to bring this about. Professor Bisbee reports, and this should be on screen, it is, that by the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, this is his paragraph 6, there had been numerous opportunities where the statutory guidance and regulatory compliance testing regime could have been made simpler or less permissive. However, in each case, there appears to have been powerful commercial and ideological incentives to increase complexity while also increasing flexibility for industry. I show, that's Professor Bisbee, that the resulting complexity, coupled with widespread incompetence and poor regulatory oversight of built environment professions and professionals, significantly contributed to the disastrous fire safety outcomes at Grenfell Tower. We agree, and further say that in pursuit of deregulation and austerity cuts, and in slavish awe of the construction and petrochemical industries, the government abdicated its duty to British citizens to protect them from foreseeable harm. This had a material contribution to the Grenfell Tower disaster. This inquiry, we submit, this inquiry will have to determine whether the confusion and ambiguity in ADB materially contributed to the disaster. We submit that while not absolving design or construction professionals of their responsibility for failings as regards the installation of unacceptably dangerous external cladding, confusion and ambiguity caused by ongoing deregulation, coupled with the effect on building control bodies of austerity cuts and marketisation, made these people's work more difficult and was likely to have been a contributory factor causing the disaster at Grenfell Tower. This is supported, for example, by Mr. Hoban's comments at the conclusion of his evidence. This was on day 46 at page 217. Mr. Holborn said, "The other thing I'd like to say is that if we had a regulatory body like we had with the Greater London Council and the regulations and building acts and constructional bylaws that we had at that particular time, and a support network of the experts that administered the regulations at that time, I don't think we'd be in a position where we are now." So, turning from building safety to the deregulation of the fire and rescue services and of the fire safety regime. The Fire and Rescue Services Act of 2004 deregulated and fragmented, i.e. localised, important aspects of fire and rescue services. We've submitted about this earlier, so I'll take it briefly. The Act of 2004 removed national standards of fire cover, leaving local fire and rescue services to determine their own standards in light of their individual integrated risk management plans, with inevitable slippage in the speed and weight of predetermined attendance to emergencies and in other departments. This was a retrograde step which effectively devolved research and development in firefighting equipment, procedures and practices to local fire and rescue services. Moreover, the IRMP process was hopelessly fettered by its link to budgeting, so that the provision of fire and rescue services across the country was driven not by a true assessment of risk, as it should have been, but by finances, which had been cut in austerity. The abolition of national standards created a race to the bottom within the Fire and Rescue Service. The Act abolished the Central Fire Brigades Advisory Council. Since 1947, this has been an important national body whose remit covered reviewing lessons from major fires, decisions about national standards and guidance, inspection enforcement of fire safety, the planning for operational incidents, and the training that arises from such planning. Crucially, it had worker representation by firefighters. There was no such representation at a national level in 2017. Its abolition, unsuccessfully challenged in the courts by the FBU, was a profoundly retrograde step. Initially, the CFBAC was replaced by the Practitioners' Forum. However, this was abolished by Lord Pickles and the coalition government after the 2010 election. Lord Pickles doesn't comment in his statement on this further deregulatory step, which led to the dearth of national guidance and a significant weakening of national oversight, horizon scanning or lesson learning. The Act of 2004 removed the requirement for cuts to firefighter numbers to be approved by a minister. The new arrangement allowed fire authorities or chief fire officers to reduce firefighter numbers without constraints. It abolished Her Majesty's Inspectorate for the Fire and Rescue Service in England. Chief fire officers were now allowed to peer review. It introduced an additional duty on fire and rescue services to carry out community fire safety education, which, whilst welcome in principle, placed a further significant duty on the Fire and Rescue Service without a corresponding increase in resource. This policy was justified in part by the fact that the number of fires and casualties had been declining, which Lord Pickles refers to in paragraphs 26 and 28 of his statement. But though falling numerically, these fires were increasing in complexity and severity as buildings were becoming more complex, e.g. with the installation of rain screen cladding systems to existing high-rise residential buildings, as we've seen at Grenfell and across the country. The complexity of modern-day fires and the increased flexibility afforded to local fire and rescue services means that a national body is more important than ever to consider the lessons from fires and provide considered national guidance tailored to the modern world of firefighting. The CFBC would have been the ideal forum to consider the recommendation of the coroner from the Lackland fire inquest in relation to stay put, get out and stay out. Evacuation of a high-rise residential building in the event of a fire would be a difficult and complex operation, as Mr. McGurk advises, as paragraph 26 of his report. There is still no practical strategy or operational procedure in the UK or internationally for the evacuation of a high-rise residential building in a fire. As a direct result of deregulation, such discussions did not happen. It wasn't just the fire and rescue services, it was the fire safety regime that was deregulated. The regulatory reform, Fire Safety Order 2005, Fire Safety Order, became law in October 2006. I wonder if we could see the next document now. It's FBU 50108 at page 18, paragraphs 45 to 46. Let me know if you didn't get that. So the Fire Safety Order repealed the certification and enforcement regime of the Fire Precautions Act 1971, under which certain high-risk buildings, albeit not generally high-rise residential buildings, were required to hold a valid fire safety certificate issued annually after an inspection by the Fire and Rescue Service. Instead, the Fire Safety Order introduced a self-compliance regime, with fire risk assessments becoming the responsibility of a responsible person for the building. The government knew of the risk of the increasingly widespread use of unsafe cladding materials from the FBU's submission to the Select Committee in June of 1998. That submission provided that the primary risk, therefore, of a cladding system is that of providing a vehicle for assisting uncontrolled fire spread up the outer face of the building, with the strong possibility of the fire re-entering the building at higher levels via windows or other unprotected areas in the face of the building. This in turn poses a threat to the life safety of the residents above the fire floor. The government knew what ought to be done about it after receiving the report of the Select Committee on the 5th of January 2000. At paragraph 22, the Select Committee recommended that the Department and the Housing Corporation instruct local authorities and registered social landlords to undertake a review of their existing building stock with a view to ascertaining how many multi-storey buildings are currently using external cladding systems and how many cladding systems are in use, which, whilst complying with the regulations in force at the time when they were installed, do not comply with current regulations. But no such instruction was given. Instead, it was left to responsible persons to carry out what they considered to be a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment without any guidance for existing high-rise residential buildings with rain-screen cladding. Please now see the next document that's MET 00012981 at page 19, paragraph 5.3. The deregulated self-compliance fire safety regime was loose and far less effective than the certification procedure, which could have been but wasn't extended to high-rise residential buildings. In 2018, it was reported that 500 out of 800 of the UK fire risk assessors were not registered with accredited bodies. Colin Todd told the police one consequence of deregulation, and this is the citation on screen, paragraph 5.3. Although there have been calls by many bodies for mandatory certification or registration of fire risk assessors or fire risk assessment companies, government has always strongly resisted any proposal that this should be a legal requirement. And the panel will doubtless remember he reinforced that in his oral testimony. This resistance flew in the face of the senior coroner's recommendation in his Regulation 28 report following the inquest into the death of the firefighter and FBU member Stephen Hunt in Manchester, as well as the recommendation made after Lakanal. The deregulatory policy of the Fire Safety Order, particularly the government's failure to regulate competency, thus led to the appointment of Mr. Carl Stokes, who was insufficiently qualified and incompetent to risk assess the fire safety of such a complex building. He didn't properly assess the rain screen cladding system and described as tolerable the severe risk it presented. Neither the Fire Safety Order nor the guidance provided under Article 50 helped him, because they didn't clarify whether the fire risk assessment duty applied to the envelope of the building. The duty applied to the common parts of a high-rise residential building, but this term wasn't defined. The government's mistaken view was that it did not apply to the external envelope. As the LFB were told, see the written opening statement for Module 3 of the LFB of the 30th of March 2021, and the reference for that is LFB 00120945, page 2 at paragraph 8. Like the unfit-for-purpose building safety regime, the lax regulatory and safety regime of the Fire Safety Order was a further source of encouragement of a complacent attitude to fire safety. See, for example, what Tony Pearson of Exover said. This is on day 19 at page 84. He said, the fact that they, the LFB, appear to be happy for the building to continue to be operated would suggest that there's a general consensus that, although it's not code compliant, the risks in the context of the regulatory reform order are tolerable. Lord Pickles stated that he excluded the Fire Safety Order from the coalition government's policy of removing unnecessary and bureaucratic rules and the red tape challenge, i.e. their policy of deregulation. But that statement is disingenuous. He well knows the fire safety order itself was the product of earlier deregulation, to which he also refers in his statement. Secondly, the orders regime was itself the product of a very substantial and prolonged deregulation exercise under the previous government, leading to many legislative provisions being repealed and a streamlined content being contained in the order. And that's in his witness statement at paragraphs 29 to 30. Business was more than happy with the greatly reduced provisions in the fire safety order. The coalition government Fire Minister Mr Bob Neal MP told an all-party parliamentary fire safety and rescue group seminar on the 9th of May 2011 that the fire safety order was effective, well received by many in the business community and proportionate. We submit that central government policy of deregulation of both the fire and rescue service and of the fire safety regime was a further underlying contributory cause of the disaster. Lord Pickles and the failure to take any significant action following the fire at Lakenal House. The coroner's Rule 43 letter in 2013 contained several recommendations in relation to central government. We are confident the inquiry will investigate them all closely, and having heard Anne Studd QC for the Mayor earlier this afternoon, I now just look at one of the coroner's recommendations. It was the one about stay put. It was recommended that the government publish consolidated national guidance in relation to the stay put principle and its interaction with get out and stay out policy, including how such guidance is disseminated to residents. Lord Pickles effectively did nothing beyond erroneously asserting that the LGA, the Local Government Association Guide of 2011, already gave such guidance and had been reviewed in 2012 with stakeholders expressing a high degree of satisfaction. The chairman of the LGA from 2011 to 2014 was Sir Merrick Cockle, a champion of deregulation and leader of the Royal Borough of Kensington Council from 2000 to 2013. The coroner's recommendation a year later, in 2013, and arising from the deaths of 6 people at Lakenal, should have informed Lord Pickles that that was not the case. A timely review might have resulted in national guidance, including on the revocation of stay put and evacuation of high-rise residential buildings in the event compartmentation fails during a major fire. However, nothing was done. Even now, 4 years after the fire, there's still no such guidance. Skip all of those because they've been covered so well by others. None of her recommendations were implemented either effectively or at all, either by Lord Pickles, his successors, or anyone else in government. This was the consequence of the government's deregulatory agenda. Further, this failure had significant consequences both for the occupants of Grenfell Tower and the firefighters who attended the disaster. We submit there is an urgent need for a national oversight body to consider Rule 43 and Regulation 28 reports and other recommendations from reliable sources to ensure they are properly reviewed and implemented. Turning, if I may, to privatisation and the culture that private is best. Since how am I doing for time? I'm a little over, I'm afraid.
You're running a bit long, yes. How much more have you got?
If I have a look at the black line, I think realistically, I've obviously taken far too long. I think realistically I've got about 10 minutes, but I can take it a bit shorter.
Well, we're not going to stop you in your tracks, but insofar as you can slim it down, perhaps you would.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated. I'll do that. Well, the essential point of this section of our oral submissions is that the private sector has demonstrated that it didn't think fire and it treated compliance as getting it past building control. So far from benefiting the building sector and the regulatory sector, the introduction of private companies had the opposite effect. So we've demonstrated that at paragraphs 91 of our written opening statement in respect of all the companies involved in Grenfell. And we've looked at the effect on building control in our written opening statement. And far from providing good quality work, the evidence shows that the workmanship of the private sector companies at times was quite shocking, as we've set out in paragraph 93 of our statement. And also the culture of deceit, cronyism and corruption that we've set out in paragraph 99 of our written opening statement should be avoided if possible. Specifically looking at the marketisation of the London Fire Brigade, there have been failed attempts to marketise the Fire and Rescue Service in London, and these show the unacceptable safety and financial risks incurred with privatisation. In October 2011, the FBU, the GMB and Unison commissioned research into privatisation in London's fire service training and control centres and concluded that it would compromise safety and bring high financial risks. The report highlighted the poor performance of previous public partnerships, finding that 1 in 5, that's 20% of these strategic partnership contracts, had either been terminated, reduced in scope, or suffered significant operational or financial problems. Just to mention, and not go into too much detail, of failed attempts in the LFB, Assetco, which was sold to private equity for just £2 in September 2012 to look after the Brigade's fleet, and was brought back into the public sector just a few months later. The fire control project in Control, and the taxpayer is still paying £50,000 a day in rent for 80 empty buildings. And the National Audit Office report of 2011 found that the implementation of fire control was heavily reliant on consultants and interim staff, and the project was rightly dubbed by the Public Accounts Committee as one of the worst cases of project failure. And we've seen what happened with the distracting introduction of the new vision system by Capita in the control room. And we've heard evidence of the difficulties working under the contractual arrangement with Babcock's for initiating new training. So far from benefiting industry, the introduction of privatisation, the inquiry may conclude, was a disaster. Testing and certification, I know that's been covered very effectively by others, so I won't go into it. Not much has been said about social housing, but Grenfell Tower, along with much of social housing, had suffered decades of neglect and repair and lack of investment. We detail the impact of this and how it contributed to the disaster in paragraphs 121 to 134 of our written submissions. The use of cheap cladding that caused the fire was due, at least in part, to the need to save money and keep the refurbishment within budget. This in turn was a consequence of central government policy restricting the funds that could be used for capital works in council housing. The decay and neglect of social housing by central government did not just mean that the occupants of Grenfell Tower had poor quality homes. We say it materially contributed to costing 72 of them their lives. We've said enough about austerity cuts. I'm sure you've got our points on that. May I just give you our conclusion, sir, and I'll terminate.
Okay.
The central state has a fundamental responsibility for the safety of its citizens in a modern democracy. We submit that central government has failed woefully in this task. They failed to regulate high-rise residential buildings, and specifically the foreseeably hazardous, albeit desirable, process of insulating them against the cold and rain by installing rain screen cladding systems. They've cut back regulations and allowed businesses to ignore fire safety rules as part of a war on health and safety culture and to prioritise profit over safety. They've abdicated the duty to research and develop emerging fire risks and protection measures, whereas for half a century central government had an authoritative statutory fire and rescue advisory body that strategically assessed the risks and provided ministers with reliable expertise. That was abolished as part of deregulation at a time when the built environment was increasing in complexity. The abolition of the CFBAC has been a disastrous failure. The philosophy of deregulation has blighted efforts to improve and has actually worsened the living conditions of millions of people. And we call for certain recommendations. Thank you, sir, for giving the FBU the opportunity to make these submissions, for listening to them. And here's hoping you can find some time to celebrate this special day. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Seaward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that doesn't quite finish the opening statements because we have 3 more in the programme, but each of those has been programme for tomorrow, and I don't think any of those who are going to make their closing statements would thank me for suggesting they do it here and now. So we're going to break at that point, and we shall resume tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock when we shall hear the final three closing statements. So that's it for this afternoon. We break now. We resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. Thank you very much.